Yes, please. Yeah. 2 months at rate, a pound or a 3 pound in weight. How many? How many? 8 to 50. What else? Green. They're all up and training. 2:30. It doesn't feed.
What was that on the Christmas punch wash?
Yeah. 12 a pound. 3:30. It's over 2 pound in great. 3:30. It's over 2 pound great. It's all the same. We haven't got time to split it. It's all the same. Who's a pound?
Another dozen pair of cotton socks for £4. Another dozen pair of cotton boots on 16 a feet now. Anybody else want another dozen? Cotton socks a dozen
Okay, Barry, I think in this shop.
Hey, four for a pound here, come on. Okay, do you want to film it? Come on, what's that? $3.99.
One of the old soldiers.
Wasn't he very?
Oh, one of the best in it. East End, old East End Market. And used to live round the corner. Brothers round.
Can you imagine it? Being done for shoplifting because your kid next door.
No one who wants serving a £10 there for these and those Ray-Bans here, look. Any pair you like there for £10.
Well, it was going on.
You're fairly in love with now.
Thank you. Think about it somewhere quieter.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Barry, do you want to just walk? Oh, hang on, let's just switch this off.
Filming.
Yeah. I can't bloody well see him. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to change the focusing as we advance.
First we'll do a 1 hour version, also a 3 hour version, depending on how keen people are with the ideas. I've got lots of material. Don't know, that's going to take a lot of work. Well, you want to get some, we're trying to get a few live footage as well. I don't know. Go and Right. Oh, should we shoot it? Let's wait till that started.
you want to talk about financial?
Yeah, let's go for it.
But if I give you a specific pause between the two.
Right, yeah. Don't worry about the edit. Okay. Action. Okay, so we're doing.
Is it focused? Or?
Yeah, we're focused and we're rolling. Okay. Right. What arguments would you put forward for privatisation of the issue of money?
Right. Essentially, we come across this phenomenon in studying the economy, and that is what is known as inflation, whereby, in purely monetary terms. Sorry, can we start again?
Okay.
What's up?
No, it's okay. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to move you to the right side. Do you mind just walking around one face to the right? Okay. Mark, you just readjust that mic so it's directly.
Right. Inflation is a purely monetary phenomenon. It concerns the expansion of the monetary base, essentially the sorry.
Okay, don't worry, that's fine. Hang on a second.
Right. Sorry. Okay.
So repeat when you ask a question.
Yeah.
Right. What arguments would you put forward for the privatisation of the issue of money?
In approaching the idea of privatisation of money, we might start by. Okay, so again, when one of the fundamental purposes given to government and justifications for its intervention in the economy by most mainstream economists, be they Keynesian, monetarist or otherwise, is that the government should be there to try to stop, or at least control, the rate of inflation within the economy. Now, inflation is not to do with rising prices as a specific thing. It is actually the expansion of the monetary base that is the real key to understanding what inflation is. It's in fact a monetary phenomenon that then leads on into rising prices for producer and consumer goods and services. So what we should be looking at is how can we best control inflation, because of the problems it has with coordination of economic activities. We'd be able to calculate what is the most desirable means of producing something in economic terms rather than purely technological terms. What it comes down to is how does government know, or how does government actually maintain control of the money supply? There's basically in the literature two key ways of doing so. One is either by a sort of rule-based system whereby a specific institutional setup is created, whereby the inflation rate is allowed to expand by so much each year, or there is the sort of more arbitrary way of basically allowing a certain expert to dictate that rate of inflation. Neither of the methods have actually been able to stamp out inflation. Really comes down to the call for a privatisation of the money supply. In 1976, Hayek issued a challenge to the state monopoly of money by calling for, first of all, choice in currency, and then secondly going on to the far more radical proposal of denationalising money, whereby instead of the Bank of England, as you see behind me, you'd actually have private banks and other institutions, firms and so on, individuals, supermarkets, issuing their own money. What they'd be doing would be, say, offering customers the chance to bank their wealth, put wealth in, and instead of merely being a warehouse issuing receipts, those receipts issued for storing people's valuable possessions would actually be exchangeable amongst other people, so that instead of just a warehouse receipt, that warehouse receipt becomes a token that is accepted by other people in exchange for goods and services. So what we have is a move back to what is fundamentally the driving force of money in the first place, or the creation of money, which is consumer evaluations of what they think is most suitable as the most marketable commodity. We then discover what money really is again, and by this process we can find out, through the market process, we can find the method of banking that people most prefer, one that is going to be stable. Because if you take in your warehouse receipt or your private money issue and you can't get that money back, you can't get your wealth back from the bank, then that bank is acting in a fraudulent manner. If you wanted to redeem your pounds today, your pound notes, your £5 notes, £10 notes and so on, to the Bank of England, you can redeem it into what? Into pound notes. You haven't actually redeemed them into any hard commodity. Under a free banking system, you'd expect to find banks issuing their scrip that is backed up by a sizable deposit of real assets, and they'd be redeemable into commodities upon demand. You go in and you ask for your commodity in return. There'd be a specific exchange rate as well between that note and the commodity to back up the currency. If they couldn't afford to cover, or they couldn't actually cover your claims for redemption, then they turn that into a interest-bearing bond, as happened in the Scottish banking period, whereby to prevent loss of faith, to maintain their reputations, the sort of Scottish banknotes were actually turned into interest-bearing bonds, redeemable after about 6 months, as longer-term assets were sort of liquidated by the bank in order to pay off these newly created bonds. The claim that the banks were actually acting fraudulently because they are a fractional reserve is ameliorated by this option clause. In the case of the Bank of England and of the other banks you see around the country, each of those is actually fraudulent in terms of, one, you cannot redeem into anything else but itself, and secondly, it's fractionally reserved, considering there is supposed to be some kind of gold reserves to the country. There isn't enough to go around, and should there be a rank run on the banks, you'll actually create more havoc, more chaos, than would result in running a free banking economy. The free banking episode in Scotland, when there was a bank run, all the banks covered their debts. It was the English Bank of England, operating until the nationalisation of the banking industry in about 1845, that the main problems occurred, and that it had spillover effects into Scotland. The alternative paradigm of free banking, consumer choice and so on, is again mirrored in the Shall I go on about financial services now?
Yeah.
Was that okay, or?
Yeah, that was fine. It sounded absolutely first class. Should we go straight into that now?
Which one is that?
Ask the question. What is it? Finance? Is it about?
What's the importance of stock exchange and other dealing institutions in the finance market economy? Right. Okay. So, what is the importance of stock exchanges and other dealing institutions in the market economy?
Right. The stock exchange is basically primarily as a marketplace for stocks and shares in companies. Effectively, it's just a normal market, but in different commodities. It's more closely tied with people's expectations on the future, in the form of holding shares to specifically speculate about future dividends for companies, about future outcomes for companies and so on. So it's much more tied to a speculative purpose than probably more mundane forms of the market, as we sort of saw in along Brick Street. The stock exchange, however, has one fundamental flaw, and that's basically it's regulated by the state. the state has come to sort of dominate financial sectors, supposedly to control and to protect against the market. The 1929 Wall Street crash that basically obliterated huge segments of wealth throughout the stock markets of the world is actually blamed upon, how should you say, rampant laissez-faire capitalism. That, unfortunately, is a complete misreading of what actually happened. If you look back in terms of the rise in price, or any rise in price during the period leading up to that, you find out that there's no significant rise. The prices remain fairly stable. The fact that output was increasing would suggest that there should actually have been a sort of period of deflation, that prices should have fallen. The fact that prices had not fallen was indicative of the fact that the federal government, through the Federal Reserve Bank in America, was expanding the money supply in America. Similarly over in Britain, that was the case. The fact that it was supposedly tied to the gold standard, it did not really hamper this expansion. With the realization that malinvestments were being made, that the economy was not growing as fast as people thought, there was not this great big pool of demand out there. In fact, it was actually almost figments of people's imagination. You then get this massive wipeout. Indeed, on the eve of the collapse, Irving Fisher was saying how the economy was bound to reach new heights. It's currently at a plateau, and it was going to soar higher, ever higher and higher. The next day, the Wall Street crash occurred. But why should I be calling for deregulation? Surely we should be preventing sort of people making these decisions that lead to so much harm, people jumping out of windows, massive debts being created, pension funds being wiped out. But essentially each of those is a consequence of a prior intervention by the state. Now what we want to try to do is actually to go to sort of market-based regulation, whereby people actually have to be responsible over their property. At the moment with Lloyd's talking about how so many names stand to be wiped out, they are forgetting the fact that each of those was speculating that, each name was speculating that he would gain by doing so. He was betting his shirt and his wealth all the way along the line, hoping that he would actually gain from doing so. When it comes to the regulation of the stock exchange, the state sector has consistently been unable to sort of correct the problems caused by, say, the expansion of the money supply. What eventually it comes down to is that the state does not have the information necessary to regulate it. It does not know the specific information that could possibly avert problems, simply because its processes can't enable that information to be generated. Only the market process can generate the information needed by the regulators to supposedly maintain the idea that regulation is necessary to control and change outcomes in the marketplace is actually an attempt to sort of impose the planner's view, in this case a regulator of the bank, through the Bank of England and the Stock Exchange, his view of what should be the outcomes of market transactions. The market process is the means by which information is generated through the interaction of buyers and sellers in the marketplace. There is simply not, there is no way that the planner or the regulator can find out that information except through the market process. The market process is one fundamental sort of penalty to bad decisions, and that is bankruptcy. You go broke. You effectively face a stark choice of either changing your acts, doing things better, being able to better read the economy and what other people do, or else starving to death effectively. If you're unwilling to change, there is always this final outcome that there is sort of bad. If you choose things consistently badly, you'll end up blown up in your face. The state, by coming in and trying to manipulate events so these things cannot happen, divorces responsibility from control of assets, so much so that say the names of Lloyds are no longer responsible for assessing risks. They want to be reimbursed for putting their money forward. They don't want to lose that money. They want to have the sure thing, so much that they can't lose. Like in savings and loans in America, when it became irrational not to take extreme risk because you would be bailed out if the savings and loans if the loan went bust, or you'd lose the money to competitors if you didn't take the greatest risk in order to gain the returns. So effectively, sorry. Not go very well.
No, that's all right. That sounds fine. Do you want to carry on, or is that enough?
Don't know.
Okay, let's just have a test. I mean, I'll just ask the first question. Do you want to just say who you are? I mean, and what did you have for breakfast today?
Right. Hello, it's Barry MacLeod-Cullinane, speaking for David Botsford's Appreciation Society for the explication of libertarian and Austrian economics ideas.
Sorry, I'm not getting any audio now. Sure. Okay, Martin.
I said I'll see you.
See you, Martin.
Yeah.
Bye.
Cheers. Hope it goes well.
What do you understand by the concept of the market?
Right. Basically, because whenever I start, the market is essentially a. I can't get settled.
Don't worry. You okay there? Do you want to stand somewhere else?
No, it's okay here. It's alright.
Have you got hay fever?
No, just my eyes are itching.
Do you want to have a dropping or something? Yeah, what do you understand by the concept of the market?
Right. I just can't start thinking.
Don't worry.
Stop it.
Loading.
Okay. When we're studying human interaction, there are essentially two ways that humans can deal with one another. One is voluntarily through those institutions that we might label the market. The other is through power, and typically that constitutes either the state or if it's just on the individual level, that is more commonly associated with what is known as the criminal element: robbers, thieves, burglars, hitmen and the like. But economists are primarily concerned with looking at human interaction and tracing both the unintended consequences and the intended consequences of such action.
Can't get going.
That's alright. That's alright.
Right.
What do you understand by the concept of the market?
Right. Essentially, the market is simply. Sorry. So I'll start when ready. Essentially, the market is a name given to any form of voluntary interaction amongst individuals. We can differentiate simply. Sorry. Let's start again. Oh God, I can't do this. The market. I can't do this. It's really upsetting.
Don't worry.
Can't start.
What do you understand by the concept of the market?
Right, the market can only. Oh, sorry. Start again. I don't know. Let's see. The concept of the market can only really be understood when we go back to the origin of what can be taken to be the institution of the market. That is purposeful human. Sorry. Again. The concept of the market can only be understood when we consider what is the origin of what we're talking about, the concept of the market. Sorry. I can't get excited. See. The concept of the market as an institution, as buying and selling, can only really be understood when we go back to the origins of the market in what could be described as purposeful human action of individuals selecting plans and creating I can't oh God, I can't get settled.
Don't worry. Tell me when you're ready. Should we cut it?
Pardon?
Do you want to carry right on or should we cut?
Do you want
have a break?
Just a break, yeah.
What do you understand by the concept of the market?
Right. Basically, when we consider the market, what we're looking at is a spontaneous order of an institution that has arisen as a result of a human action, but is not actually the consequence of human design. What I mean by this is when we look back at the origin of the market institution, we have to look in terms of the building blocks of that, those sort of motive forces of it, which is purposeful human action. Individuals select plans in order to try to achieve or satisfy goals and aspirations that they select. These goals being chosen because they feel some uneasiness, some disquiet, or they particularly wish to change their situation in some way. Now, it's not part of economics to consider the subject matter of these ends, but it is the subject matter of the economic inquiry to consider the means by which individuals hope to achieve these ends. So we can look at which means are most appropriate. Now, individuals can select one or two ways of interacting with other individuals in order to try to achieve their goals. These are violence and voluntarism. Violence is sort of commonly associated with petty thieves, robbers, burglars, rapists, murderers, where one individual uses force to place another individual's property and person at the coercer's disposal. So that the person who initiates the coercion uses the other person as the means to the power freak's own ends. Now, the person who is being aggressed against clearly does not want to pursue the goals that are being set by the aggressor. If you did want to, then there would be little or no reason for violence being initiated. Why force somebody to do what you want when he's going to do it anyway? But the person who uses violence does so. He subjects the other one to his sorry. When someone uses violence against another, they no longer really speak of them as a sort of almost an equal associate. They now regard them as a subject to their. Sorry, cut this bit, but keep the earlier bit if you want. The alternative to violence is voluntary interaction, where both parties choose to associate, choose to interact with the other in order to achieve their particular goals. Now, they can choose to cooperate on a single project in order to, say, build a house in which both of them are to live, or they might choose to trade items, such as I'm a beaver hunter, and this other person hunts fishes. Now, just eating beaver meat or using beaver fur isn't particularly exciting, or doesn't satisfy all my needs. Maybe I want to have fish. Now, the other person who does not have sort of beaver fur or beaver meat, bit fed up with his diet of purely fish and wants some clothes come winter time, so we decide to trade, to interact. He exchanges fish and I exchange beaver. Now, the interaction creates an exchange ratio. So many beaver exchange for so many fish. The exchange ratio or price of one good in terms of another arising not because either was planned to create the price, but because we both intended to try to get the goods held by the other and to persuade him to accept our goods in return. Now, when the price arises, other people can look at that to orientate their decisions, their activities in regard to scarce resources of time and natural supplies and their own energies, in order to try to satisfy their plans more exactly, more appropriately. So they can change their behaviour should they be seen, they now realise that they're embarking upon what could be described as erroneous courses, because of time, information has changed, circumstances have changed, and as a result people have to reinterpret their surroundings. They have to change and alter their plans in order to get a better grasp on reality around them. Now, prices act that in this way because they are objective measurements of individuals' subjective evaluations upon the usefulness of one good for another. Now, it's pretty hard in a sort of simple barter economy where you need to have a double coincidence of wants, with each individual party to a trade wanting exactly what the other one has to offer, and also in quantities that are interchangeable. It's no use two of us agreeing to provide materials in order to build a house in which one is to live and the other one is going to be paid off in some way, when those units are not divisible into a common unit of accounting. Now, there is a sort of entrepreneurial leap forward in the discovery of money, which is the most marketable commodity that is available in the economy. By exchanging my goods for this good, this money, or what will become money, I can hope to secure the fulfillment of my plans easier than by having to search out somebody who wants exactly what I have to offer in the quantities I have to offer for the things that I want. Now, as soon as I start to do this, other people follow me, and so what we have is the emergence of money, usually associated with things like gold and other precious metals, which are easily divisible, portable and durable. And so what we find is money arising into which is a common unit into which all other goods have prices or exchange ratios that they can be exchanged into it. As soon as we have money, we can compare the possible outcomes, or what we consider the possible outcomes of our activities in terms of monetary terms in comparison with other options. When I formulate a sort of plans to try to achieve a particular end, I can see is my time and effort and my resources being used most profitably, or could I employ them elsewhere? By returning to this idea of monetary calculation, I can try to give some kind of qualification to my plans. I can choose to see whether or not things are economically feasible, that is, that value created from those enterprises, that action is greater than the value of the resources that go into creating those outcomes. So that rather than just looking at the purely technologically feasible, whether or not it is possible to make a titanium bicycle, I can say whether or not making a titanium bicycle is actually the most valuable or most profitable use of scarce resources of time and effort and titanium. There could be other more useful exercises for titanium, such as planes or structural engineering or pressure or other uses. Bicycles probably come lower down the list. Certainly steel and aluminium and carbon are more likely to be used than titanium. This is because society, through the whole collection of individuals, through the price mechanism, deems titanium as a more valuable resource, and hence it commands a higher price in order to be used in such activities. Thus, what we find is a filtering device, a way by which individuals' actions are orientated within the scope of this social context, that they can decide which is the most profitable use of their resources. Now, as soon as we start using violence, this goes to pot. No longer can the individuals choose to interact in those ways that they see fit. Now now one side forces the other to accept a particular price for a good, to accept a particular rate of exchange, or to accept regulations over how his resources and his time and property in his own person are to be used at the diktat of the other. The most common sort of use of violence is not the thief or the burglar. They sort of strike relatively infrequently to most people. The most common use of violence is in the form of the state, whereby state regulations concerning labour, in the form of union activity, in the form of mediums of exchange, in the form of exchange of materials, be it drugs, be it pornographic literature, be it supposedly dodgy food, be it firearms, etc., or be it other prescribed materials like books, or supposedly unsafe building materials. Any number of things that are supposedly done in someone's interests, but in fact actually mean that other people can no longer fulfill their own aims, their desires, their pleasures, or any other good intention. We find that somebody makes decisions for others. They subject other people to harassment. They force them to accept certain wage contracts. They use the state's apparatus to force them to have pensions and unemployment insurance and health insurance. When somebody feels healthy, says, I don't really want that, I don't want to be insured, or says, well, actually I do want to be insured, but I want to be insured for certain things. I want good teeth, I want good face, but I may not feel it's necessary for heart insurance, say. Range of things. We're prescribed ways in which we can interact with others. We cannot do business on Sundays, for instance, except in certain goods. And there you see the government comes in and forces us to accept a certain medium of exchange, which it determines. Money, which originally arises as a result of the interplay of voluntary interaction, voluntary subjective evaluation and subjective evaluations of the worth of goods, is now thought to be an objective fact, that the monetary unit, what we have in our pockets, sort of cash, so notes, or even the figures in our bank accounts, is all thought to be an objective fact, that the government creates that money, that the money supply is somehow a function of the government. In fact, it's not. When the government comes in, it sees the money supply, the creation of money, as a way of creating wealth for itself, and also of guiding the economy in the ways that the government rulers, the bureaucrats and the politicians see as best from their perspective. Now, originally money was started as a result of bartering, of exchange, moving from direct exchange into indirect exchange. Government comes along and monopolises the issue of the monetary medium, and with that we find the government trying to manipulate the money supply in terms of its growth, basically printing more money by getting the notes and adding zeros, just increasing the number of the print runs and so on. And it's no longer tied to a specific monetary unit, it's now a simple arbitrary fiat currency. The paper in it is perhaps the only relatively useful part of the money itself, because you could probably roll it up and use it as a cigarette paper. But the government, by monopolising the issue of money, the government has divorced money from its real meaning in terms of a medium of exchange. No longer do people exchange directly into money, they try to get round it in terms of going into the black economy. Sorry, missed that. Cut that bit.
Is that it?
Can you just pause a moment?
Yeah. What are the central problems involved with state intervention in the economy?
Right. The essential problems of state intervention in the economy is this distortion of economic calculation in its purest form, in the fact that as a result of regulations, of taxation, and of also of inflation, which is the government expansion of the monetary unit, no longer can individuals decide accurately what is the most profitable use of their resources. Let me just amplify this a bit. When individuals are seeking to discover the most appropriate means to achieve a particular end, they will look at the resources they have and decide whether or not they deem the sort of plan that they are about to put into action the most profitable in terms of the use of those resources. Now, they do this by comparing what they consider the alternatives could be, so that if I decide I'm thinking about use my resources to achieve goal X, and I consider Y and Z alternatives, then the cost of carrying out and trying to achieve goal X is the benefits and the values I attach to alternatives Y and Z. Now, as soon as I start to look at that, I need to have some way to quantify those alternatives, the value of those alternatives, and the costs I attach to those alternatives in foregoing them at the moment of choice. Now, without a unit of common computation into which I can divide all of the expected values from those alternatives, there's no way I can accurately decide which is the most profitable use of my resources, and hence society's use of resources. Now, the state comes in and through regulation and taxation distorts what people can and can't do with their resources and their time and effort. But when it attacks the medium of exchange through inflation, it distorts every person's decisions, because there's no longer a stable unit of computation. People see the current currency, which is the pound sterling, and they think, yes, I can achieve X amount of pounds or Y amount of pounds, or Z amount of pounds worth of value from doing this particular, from making this particular choice. But what they do not see is the fact that the pound sterling is being depreciated by the inflation rate. That no longer can it buy as many things as it did yesterday, because there is a growth in the actual number of pounds circulating. What this implies for the whole economy is that resources are now being diverted to areas where previously they would not have gone. Because inflation cannot strike everybody at once, everybody suffered a 200% increase in their change in their pocket, and hence they consider 200% increase in their spending power, and went out to try to do that. In fact, there isn't any increase at all. All prices would simply do is double overnight. But in fact, inflation strikes in one point and spreads out. Imagine honey being poured onto a plate. There's an amount of honey underneath where the honey is poured, and then it spreads slowly. It slowly flattens down across the surface of the plate, but there's still this amount of honey. Even after the honey is no longer being poured, a still amount exists until it slowly flattens down to the rest, to the surface of the rest of the honey. The government use of inflation is like this.
Sorry, can we just stop till no.
Okay. Now, as a result of certain people getting the new issue of currency first, they then are in a position to use that money to pursue activities that they would otherwise not have entered into, and hence we get investments being made, loans being made, which, if there had not been a manipulation of or expansion of the money supply, would not have proceeded. What we have is a reduction of the rate of interest, so that more people take up loans, and there's also the use of money to pay the state's bureaucracy, so that certain sectors of the economy and people feeding into resources into those sectors, be it services or goods, receive incomes before other sectors of the economy do. But as what we've got now is a expansion of the money supply by, say, 10%. We've got a demand that's been increased and so we've got an effective demand of 110%, supposed purchasing power, on our base of 100%. Now, as soon as we got in this situation, we've got a period in which the printing presses are in a race with the demands by labour for increased wages in order to purchase the newly sorry, missed that bit. As a result of the increase in the money supply, certain groups within the economy proceed to sort of make loans and make investments, which they otherwise would not have done. There is also the fact that, as a result of this, prices in certain goods rise and other goods sort of now seem to be falling. Labour starts to demand greater wages in order to purchase this, because most of the prices seem to be rising in the economy, and we're now entering into a race between the printing presses and the union wage demands. But there is also the fact that on the stock market, people's expectations are sort of inflated as a result of the expansion of the money supply. But eventually there is a sort of crack-up boom. I can't really use the word crack-up boom, but there is a sort of cracking point at which expectations have a rain check on reality, that suddenly we get pulled back, and those malinvestments, or those investments that people who had taken, which would not have otherwise been undertaken if the market rate of interest hadn't been reduced, are now found to be unviable, because there is not the sort of purchasing power actually, or the goods to back up that demand. and so we have a contraction. We have a contraction in the economy. We enter into the recessionary aspect of the trade cycle, and we get all the horrors associated with it, being unemployment, dislocation, closures of factories, malinvestment wipeouts. The government has perpetuated this simply by trying to inflate out again, or rather than just trying to inflate out, has not attempted to halt the rate of inflation and to keep a stable money supply. In fact, it's maintained the momentum, and so each successive inflationary and then inflationary part of the trade cycle is matched with an ever worsening downside. Now, the use of taxation and regulation was not affecting everybody in the same way because of the manipulation of the medium of calculation, does in fact lead to malinvestments and use of resources where they otherwise wouldn't have been, and hence exacerbate the problems of the trade cycle. But inflation, being the cause of being a monetary phenomenon, means that price rises and price falls are no longer interpreted correctly. That resources are no longer being directed to do what people would otherwise have done, so that there is a general tendency to malinvest in the economy and to create problems which then are prevented from being solved or wound out by further manipulations of the economy by government. In this sense, the use of the individual's calculation of what is the opportunity of particular actions, his subjective evaluation of cost is undermined because he has no unit in which to calculate it. And this is really the main problem caused by government intervention in the economy, is that rational economy dissolves and is no more with the dissolution of the unit of computation. We're now forced to grope into the dark because market prices no longer reflect individuals' evaluations about reality. They in fact have moved away from objective reality and are more or less they've moved away from being orientation maps of objective reality. They are now sort of clouded crystal balls. They cannot tell us what really we need to know when we're making decisions, and hence we make malinvestments, and hence we have economic hardship. It's the government's fault. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. Right, that included something like costing subjective.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I put that on the end, that summary of.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Okay, should we talk now of the Austrian school and all that lot? What is the Austrian school of economics?
Right. Okay.
Can we pause?
Right. What I was going to do is
Austrian school.
right. Basically, the Austrian School of Economics originated with the Austrian School of Economics originated in the publication of Karl Menger's investigations into the method of the social sciences in, I think it was 1883. Now, Menger was had published an earlier work called The Principles of Economics in 1871, in which he outlined his ideas about marginal utility of value, and his commonly referred to, in fact the only references really of Austrian economics in most mainstream textbooks, is that Menger, like Stanley Jevons in Britain and Leon Walras in Switzerland, was the co-discoverer of the idea of the marginal I'll start again. Yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
Okay,
I kept getting tongue-tied in it.
Don't worry about it. Okay, I'm just actually going to move.
Right, the Austrian School of Economics originated with the publication of Menger's 1871 book, Principles of Economics. Now, Menger is usually associated with Stanley Jevons of England and Leon Walras of Switzerland as one of the co-discoverers of what is called marginal utility of value in economics, in which people look at value at the margin. The last unit of a particular set of goods is sorry, I'll start again. Am I in the picture properly? Okay. Yeah. Right. The Austrian School of the Austrian School of Economics is usually the Austrian School of Economics dates from 1871, Menger's publication of the Principles of Economics. In that, Menger describes how marginal utility of items is to be found. Sorry. The Austrian School of Economics dates back to 1871 with Menger's, with Karl Menger's. The Austrian School of Economics dates back to 1871 with the publication of Karl Menger's Principles of Economics. In this, Menger outlines how the value of items is that determined on the margin. The last unit of a particular set of goods is the determining factor for the utility which somebody gives to that unit of goods. It's easier to describe in terms of the water-diamond paradox. Many people have argued that value is inherent in items. In fact, that is completely bogus. Value is a little more than a subjective subjective appraisal upon a item's worth in the eyes of the beholder. So much so that in the desert, the number of units of say water and okay, give up. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I'll just start again.
Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it alright?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. The Austrian School of Economics dates back to Karl Menger's publication of the Principles of Economics in 1871. What Menger is commonly referred to if he is at all referred to in economic textbooks, as one of the co-discoverers of the marginal utility of value. That is the last unit of a particular set of goods is that is the last unit of a particular set of goods is that unit which is taken into account when people are making value judgments over the worth of different goods. So that in the desert, a number of people. I think I forget this bit. The Austrian School of Economics dates back to Karl Menger and his publication of the Principles of Economics in 1871. Menger is commonly referred to in economic mainstream textbooks as one of the co-discoverers of the idea of subjective value. No, sorry. The Austrian School of Economics dates back to the publication of Karl Menger's Principles of Economics in 1871. Although Menger is commonly only referred to in economic mainstream textbooks as one of the co-discoverers of the idea of marginal utility of value, he is, however, a far more interesting figure than either the other two co-discoverers, Stanley Jevons in England and Leon Walras in Switzerland. For Menger was describing not a sort of mathematical treatise or using mathematical language as did Jevons and to a great extent Walras. He described economics through words. This may seem strange when we consider how the Austrian School of Economics dates back to 1871, the publication of Karl Menger's treatise, The Principles of Economics. Now, though Menger is usually only referred to in textbooks as one of the co-discoverers of marginal utility, a value, along with Stanley Jevons in England and Leon Walras of Switzerland, he is, however, a far more interesting writer than either the other two, in the simple fact that he was positing a mode of inquiry for economy, for economists trying to understand the nature and interplay of economics. In Menger's this approach is borne out far more in the investigations of the methods of the social sciences in 1883. For in that book, Menger set out to try to state what the role of the economist should actually be. He was trying to say why economic theory should actually take precedence over basically not just empirical work, but the historicist work being done by his contemporaries like Gustav von Schmoller and the other historicists. Schmoller and his self-styled intellectual bodyguard in the House of Hohenzollern were attempting to say, well, what we see around us is only applicable to this particular instant, this particular time. It is not to be that economics cannot say anything about all time and all places. There's no laws in economics in actual fact. Menger sort of explicitly rejected this, and it is in these roots that we find the Austrian sort of perspective coming out far more, which is the insistence upon a sort of a priori theory of investigation, setting out that we have a theory by which we interpret reality rather than trying to get to these facts and then build up theory from that. We can start out with a sort of theory or sort of a pair of spectacles by which we can view and make sense of reality, that we can order the data that we see, make sense of the evidence of our senses. Menger's disciples or colleagues and associates included the likes of Eugen von Bauer, who sort of wrote a remarkable work completely collapsing Marx's ideas about sort of political economy. Capital and Interest, von Bauer completely destroys Karl Marx's ideas, which are expressed in Capital volumes 1, 2 and 3. In fact, Karl Marx never was able, or nor his disciples able to refute von Bauer's arguments, saying that value was one, subjective, and secondly that that there would be no way to actually abolish the market system. We move on into the 20th century with the next major proponent of Austrian ideas, Ludwig von Mises, and his treatise on money, which is the theory of money and credit in 1912. Mises really came to fame within the market process movement with the publication of the economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth of 1920, where he basically again stated the arguments against Marxist economics. At the time, you had these socialist experiments going on in the Soviet Union and the aftermath of wartime socialism as operated by the German war machine. Mises' arguments was that when you abolish the unit of monetary calculation, you no longer can pursue rational economy, malinvestments accumulate, economic resources are dislocated, and hardship ensues. Mises's arguments, which said that economic system that abolishes money has no, and thus has no unit of computation between goods. Labour hours can't work. There's no common unit of labour. It simply are a explicit denunciation upon the so-called scientific socialists. There is no alternative to the market system if you want to carry on living. If you want to abolish human life, or at least reduce it to the level of savages, then by all means follow a socialist system, because that is one of the surest methods of doing so, of achieving your aims of annihilating mankind. But the Austrian school, in promoting the ideas of sort of the market being sort of necessary for civilization, have been seen by the detractors from the market, people like Bukharin, as being the market's most powerful advocates, and principally the school which has to be overcome in order for a communist victory to ensue. The tide of Keynesianism, which overtook Mises' colleague F.A. Hayek, and Nazism that erupted throughout Germany and Austria, forced free market Austrian ideas to flee Austria. Hayek himself was first in London, and then later went over to America much later after the Second World War. Mises himself went first to Switzerland and then to America, but at all times they were being pursued by the spectre of collectivization, be it socialism, be it fascism, and then later the Keynesian variant. The Great Depression, which the Austrian economists saw as resulting from the expansion of the federal Reserve Board in America during the 1920s, and then culminating in the Wall Street crash and causing the 1930s depression, serve as sort of the Great Depression thus is seen as a the Great Depression is thus seen by Austrian economists as being the vindication that the market is correct. As the government intervention in the first place caused the depression, and the policies pursued during the depression, which were Keynesian, massive government expenditure on direct welfare programs, public work schemes, and also to inflate out again, perpetuated the depression. And only the sort of coming of the Second World War gave the illusion of prosperity. After the war, Austrian ideas began to make a comeback. The German economic miracle, where prices were freed, regulations removed, and so forth, that Ludwig Erhard and his colleagues pursued in about just before 1950, were as a result of their participation in Mises' seminars. They were students of Mises. They saw the need to free the economy in order to promote economic well-being. With the collapse of Keynesian prescriptions, and indeed to much extent monetarist prescriptions for how to control the economy during the 1970s, with both inflation and unemployment, which gave the lie to the idea of the Phillips curve to have expansions of the money supply to counteract unemployment. We get the Austrian business cycle being the only way to make sense of what is happening and why things are happening. The success of such theories, and indeed Hayek's Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, really marked the resurgence of interest in Austrian ideas. the Austrian school has gone from strength to strength during the 1970s and the 80s, with Kerzner, Rothbard, younger Austrians like Lavoie and Eberling coming through to provide new theories, new ways of interpreting the data, new ways to make sense of the world, and always a conviction that the free market is basically the best way of organising human affairs. The contribution that Mises made in terms of economic calculation was carried forward by F.A. Hayek when he looked at how knowledge is transmitted through the existence of market prices. As prices rise, so people are forced to change their plans to make better use of scarce resources. As prices fall, they substitute those less scarce or less socially valued resources for the more valued resources. The price system is thus a way to transmit inarticulate, tacit knowledge that is specific to certain places and times to other people throughout the economy. Today we find similar uses of these ideas of economic calculation and knowledge transmission in the works of people like Selgin, in how the money supply should function in a market economy, whereby private issuers issue money against. So I think we could scrap that.
Yeah, is that the end?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, rolling.
In 1976, 3 years before Thatcher could even begin her supposed experiment of monetarism, whereby state strictly controlled the rate of money supply growth, there were two publications put out by the Institute of Economic Affairs. Both were penned by F.A. Hayek, and both called for the basically privatisation of money. The first one, Choice in Currency, was just a sort of opening shot. The second, Denationalisation of Money, said that in order for individuals to basically interact in a consistent, rational manner in the economy, there needed to be some basis by which they could do so. The only way that a monetary unit could be established that did not fluctuate, did not have the evils associated with inflation, was by disassociating the state from the money supply. Hayek's proposal has sparked a major interest within Austrian circles because it brings back the Hayek's proposal goes back to really the origin of what money is, because it recognises how money arises in the first place as a result of individual choice and action, of individual evaluations and exchanges. Hayek's work has been followed up by two leading writers in the field, George Selgin and Larry White, who have looked at how in Scotland a free banking system operated for several decades before it was actually nationalised by the Bank of England through the government. And in the Scottish experience, the banking system was far more stable, far less prone to the collapses that dogged the English system, and also there was far less inflation associated with it. In fact, most of the banks operated on a gold-backed currency. They were actually fractional reserves, but each fractional reserve bank offered optional clauses so that if you went to the bank to redeem your currency and they could not pay up immediately, you had your notes, which usually said pay on demand. but we also reserve the right to convert those into interest-bearing bonds. So customers had the security to know of mind that their use of these banknotes would actually be secured by the banks, who converted those into interest-bearing bonds for about 6 months duration, whilst longer-term assets were liquefied. So whilst these seemed to be fractional reserve banks, and hence had all the possibilities of having the flaws of the state central banking system, i.e. fractional reserve, there could be runs on the banks. In fact, that was not the case. They took steps through the market, because this is a discovery process, to protect against that. The whole idea about privatising money presents a third way. You have monetarism on the one hand, with either a monetary rule by which there are certain strict insistences upon the part of the government not to expand the money supply by more than X amount a year, say, or not to expand it at all, and the idea of a sort of discretionary principle whereby the bank authority determines how much to expand or contract the money supply in any 1 year. The monetarist proposal is, however, flawed because it allows or has not prevented inflation. In fact, in certain cases it favours inflation or deflation, which can at times be as bad, disrupting monetary calculation. The alternative to sort of central bank is denationalisation of money. Unfortunately, because it means the government can no longer use the printing presses as a way to create money, to pay its servants, to pay for supplies, etc., and to manipulate the economy, presents this proposal as a rather sort of anarchistically minded activity. It takes away a huge function of government and a huge set range of powers of government, and undermines to a certain extent basically the sanctity of government these days. With law and order, the money supply is really the sort of one of the most basic tenets of the state. The Austrians propose an alternative to this. The Chicago school, which is seen by many as the leading light of the free market schools of economics, however, has problems when it comes to these more radical solutions. Based upon ideas of statistical aggregates like GDP, gross domestic product, and various output indicators, and the Chicago school is much more an empirically based outfit. However, on most matters, the Austrian and the Chicagoites are in very much close agreement. Whilst the Austrians come to laissez-faire positions through theory, the Chicagoites tend to come to free market positions through empirical work, saying that regulation has been so bad in these particular instances, capture of the regulatory body by various interest groups to keep out competitors to maintain monopoly position, that we therefore want to remove the source of that monopoly power, the regulatory body, i.e. remove the state from those particular industries. So whilst the Austrians talk about the economic theory of capture, the Chicagoites provide the backbone of empirical work that supports those theoretical positions. The examination of government and the functioning of government has now sort of emerged into almost a distinct school itself. The Virginian public choice school looks at how bureaucrats are in fact interested individuals. They are sort of rational in terms of pursuing various objectives that they decide and set out. They create plans by which they hope to achieve those objectives, and so they can really only be understood as self-interested individuals. That they might claim to be sort of altruists out for the public good, but in fact they are actually interested in sort of getting re-elected, getting personal power, prestige, money, a host of other things. The idea of the self-interested economic actor in the marketplace is also mirrored by the economically self-interested political agent. So that the Virginia School has provided an important return to a classical tenet of free market ideas, classical liberal class theory, say that there is a certain group of rulers with a set of interests which they want to perpetuate at the expense of others through the violence of the state, regulation, inflation and taxation, and their position of power is to be maintained at almost all costs against everybody else, the productive part of the market. The Virginia School thus helps to illuminate why it is that the various bureaucratic interests should be captured, or should want to extend their regulatory impact, and helps to understand the actual momentum of government, why more taxes, more regulations seem to emerge. And in fact, as soon as we've identified these features, we can go to some extent to work out ways to neutralise it, so that our privatisation programmes can proceed, because we know the sort of functioning of government. We can work out ways to sort of buy politicians off, to pay them off, to get rid of them in ways that doesn't cause a general alarm and a general hardening of opinion against the economy. So there is a lot of good to be said for public choice, and Chicagoite and Austrian economics. And whilst each has specific insights, the combination of these insights leads to a very, very powerful case for the free market.
Excellent, thank you. Why do you think that so many professional economists are so critical of the Austrian and other free market perspectives?
To answer that question in effectively two parts.
Hold on a second. Do you mind saying the reason why so many, or whatever?
Sorry about that.
Or there are two reasons why economists. Yeah.
Professional economists tend to be hostile to Austrian economics and free market economics in general, for two reasons. First off, their hostility to Austrian economics tends to either be as a result of the... I'll start again, because usually they haven't heard of Austrian economics. Professional economists tend to fall into one or two categories. The first being those who've heard of Austrian economics, and the second being those who haven't. Now, the hostility of professional economists towards free market perspectives can be really characterised by their understanding of the Austrian and other free market economic schools' perspective. You ask, start again. It's commonly found it's commonly found in universities and colleges that the professional economist tends to be hostile towards Austrian.
Oh, I'll tell you what, do you mind stopping, because I think we're picking up that plane.
Alright, sorry.
Can I just go into your loo while we're waiting?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, why do you think the professional economists are so hostile to Austrian and other forms of free market economics?
Right. Aside from those professional economists tend to be hostile towards Austrian economics and also other schools of free market economics for several reasons. Aside from those economists who haven't actually heard of Austrian economics, which tends to be quite a few in the academic community and indeed most of the business community, there is sort of general hostility towards people who propose basically to end your academic respectability and tenure. MacLeod once expressed how the impact of the Austrian ideas is resisted, or should be resisted, because the applications are so damaging to the interests of most mainstream economists. The simple reason that mainstream economists have spent so much in terms of their time and effort in learning and acquiring these qualifications, that for a small, what they regard upstart group of economists to come along and say, well, actually, all your methods, or almost all your methods, your ideas and your analysis and conclusions are complete bunk, that they're wrong, that they're based upon statistical aggregates that do not exist, to use equations that are meaningless, to use costs in an objective fashion, say by the fact that we can measure costs and benefits, which are two purely subjective phenomena. If we then try to use them as objective facts to make decisions, to use them in equations, in sort of cost-benefit analysis, for instance, if cost-benefit analysis is the scientific method of mainstream economics, if the Austrians come along and say, well, actually, because costs are subjective, we ought to ditch cost-benefit analysis, and then you get rid of all the cost-benefit analysis people, that is going to provoke a lot of resentment towards the Austrian school. The so-called scientific method of trying to ape the methods of the employed in the physical sciences, such as chemistry, biology and physics, is even more apparent in the case of sort of mathematical economics, where it's more or less econometrics, whereby we try to calculate all these variables and put them in such as output and productivity and capital, etc., and put them into these equations in order to get out some statistical result by which we can say the economy is growing or declining, and by how much is very, very dangerous. Capital, for instance, is really can only be defined as a good that is combined with other goods in order to make goods of lower orders and ultimately a consumer good. There's no really way to actually value capital good except in as much as it is used to create a valued consumer good. Now, to try to get some kind of index of what or statistical aggregate what it actually is capital, so we call it capital, is very, very hard, if not impossible. There is no way to work out these independent of the evaluations of individuals. Yet within these statistical models, there's no way the values of the individual are ever imputed into these. So the actual methods mean that Austrian economics calls for abolition of most methods of mainstream economists. That these more or less pure mathematic based economists should actually be mathematicians, except for the fact most of them seem to have failed maths, and they are now sort of following economics in order to perpetrate more of their that they're found to be found in economics because they've cut this bit a little bit, but you could probably edit all this up. The general hostility towards free market economics can really be traced to the fact that most mainstream economists were taught by Keynesian tutors that the accepted value structures that were being taught to them in the 1960s or earlier, which they then pass on to later their students, mean that it's been very hard for the alternatives, which is free markets, to make any kind of impact. The Keynesian views, or even some watered down Marxist views held by many economists during the 1960s, have been carried through into their students, and because of the fact that people have tenure, it means that the Keynesian doctrines remain in place in economic departments throughout the country, indeed throughout the world. It's only as a result of institutes like the Institute of Humane Studies and in the United States of America coming along and saying, right, we want to change the overall intellectual opinion. We want to actually enact what F.A. Hayek was talking about when he said, if we can change the opinion makers of society, then we can actually create or cause a sort of more market-based revolution. The aim of IHS and other institutes has been to try to place individuals who express interest and promote the ideas of the free market and classical liberalism into academic departments to help them along their sort of path of intellectual and academic development. In this way, we can then hope to sort of push the free market ideas onto a new crop of students who then go on and in sort of ever widening circles of influence. So eventually the academic community comes to be a more or less free market orientated one rather than a statist orientated one. That so many people seem to love the state or see the state as the only solution for problems that say about the environment, which is the current one, is the major one that so many economists see the state as a solution of problems such as the environment or environmental damage is basically the result of blinkered vision. They're not really aware of alternatives. The state comes along and says, right, we can protect for the public good, but what is the public good? Individuals pursue their own self-interest. They perceive what they think is best for them and try to act accordingly. Within the marketplace, within sort of a property rights system, individuals can act only legitimately within the sphere of their own property rights. As soon as they step over those property right boundaries, they are guilty of trespass. They commit violence against the people who did not invite them onto their property, say across the neighbour's fence, etc. As soon as I go onto my neighbour across the fence behind me, I'm guilty of trespass, and my neighbour can seek restitution appropriately. In terms of pollution, whereby I dump various horrible wastes upon that person's property, or I impose smoke, or you name it, which sort of spills over, as soon as that happens, all you get is a violation of someone's property rights, which could be, and that dispute could be settled within the grounds of common law torts, or civil action whereby property rights are enforced and payment has to be made. If I want to carry on polluting, maybe it would be in my interest to come to an agreement with my neighbour to allow me to do so, where I pay money or services in order for me to buy a pollution right, in which case it would not be pollution, it would simply be him agreeing for a waste disposal dump on his land. But when the state comes along, it sets certain things like sort of taxes for carbon emissions. But what does it do with those carbon emission taxes? It doesn't clean buildings down, it doesn't scrub them down, it doesn't pay for sort of the health needs for individuals suffering from those certain diseases, except very, very indirectly. So the people who are really suffering, say along a major road, where cars are being taxed for carbon or lead emissions and so forth, the state doesn't actually provide money to its inhabitants. In the marketplace, the private road, which has been patronised by individual private car owners, would seek to ensure that people on neighbouring property were not aggressed against, because that would increase the cost of operating it. Would have to be facing tort, or be having to face tort actions all the time. So to go on those roads, you'd have to fit various filters onto your car, things like that. That would occur on the marketplace, and when torts are being initiated, the people who are suffering get direct benefit, not through the indirect channels of the state with its bureaucracy and so forth. So the marketplace provides so-called public goods. In fact, what is probably the most hilarious chapter of economics textbooks tends to be what is called public goods. Lighthouses are always trotted out as the prime example of a public good, where the state has to come in and provide those lighthouses, because all those private greedy ship owners will never agree to build a costly lighthouse, have it manned 24 hours a day to prevent ships sailing onto reefs. The fact that throughout the 19th century lighthouses were being consistently built by private enterprise in various manners, and has been shown by Ronald Coase in a path-breaking essay called The Lighthouse in Economics, about sort of 25 years ago, I think, maybe longer now, and none of this has filtered through into sort of economic textbooks. Shows how blinkered economists' visions are. In fact, it could be summed up by the fact that economists generally lack imagination. So just by thinking about things, allow the marketplace, the market process to operate, whereby entrepreneurs can exert their imaginations to bring about solutions which an armchair economist, could say myself, can't think of one, is really the solution to most of the problems we see around us. And that's why the free market sort of analysis and sort of program of reform and removal of the state is so damaging to economists, because most of them seem to lack an imagination.
Thank you.
Perhaps one of the sort of biggest challenges for free market economists is how to get from here, from this sort of state-regulated, state-interfered with the economy, to there, which is sort of this market paradise of laissez-faire economics, where individuals pursue in a voluntary manner their chosen goals and ends. Now, to achieve this, we've first got to look at what is our main sort of antagonist, and that is the organised body of coercion known as the state. In order for us to achieve our proposals of laissez-faire, we must remove the coercive powers of the state in several areas. I've touched upon the idea of privatising money. Hang on. In several main areas: privatisation of money, removing the money supply from the government's control, and hence ending inflation. Secondly, taxation, by removing the power for the state to confiscate goods and services and to force people to pay a proportion of their income, which can be as much as say 98% in some historical instances, or even more, and it's currently around about 50% when we include things like VAT, but that's without regard to the hidden taxes and regulations involved in manufacture and taxation that we could. I start again. Sorry, David.
No, go on. You want to start from the top of this question? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So,
shall I ask you the question?
Yeah, if you could.
What measures would you like to see to establish a free economy?
Right. In order to establish a free economy, in order to get from here, with our state interfered with economy, which is regulated and taxed, to the laissez-faire paradise that I believe in, we really need to look at what is our main body of opposition. That really comes down to the idea of the state and the mystique surrounding the state. The idea that the state can actually provide beneficial services is actually required in human society. Now, in order to get there, we need to pursue certain policies. One is the removal of the state from the area of money, privatise or denationalise money. Secondly, we need to remove the state from the state the power to tax, to remove this power of confiscation. It's fairly arbitrary, that is carried on in an orderly manner every day through people's paychecks. When you consider how much is taken from each and every person's paycheck every working day, to finance things that the guy would never or woman never wanted, we can only describe this as a theft. Have they consented to it? Well, supposing they have consented to it, but they use the voting method to simply try to protect their interests, to get back what's been stolen from them for everybody else. So simply pointing out that they've consented through the sort of voting or democratic process is meaningless. So we need to remove the power tax. If you want to provide a service, you have to persuade people to fund it, to purchase it. Thirdly, we want to see sort of deregulation of the marketplace, removal of all the health and safety laws, so that you might say, that creates a situation of anarchy whereby industrial accidents will occur. But insurance firms will be able to pick up that situation. Higher premiums will have to be paid where there is no kind of thought given to health and safety issues. In the marketplace, there's a repeat game situation. You want customers to come back to you. You want your name brand to be seen as good quality. You want to be able to people to use that name brand. So the idea of establishing your market reputation is a way of overcoming the problems usually associated with no kind of health and safety regulations. Simply by having to require to maintain your good reputation means that you will have to pay attention to things like environmental damage, worker worker injuries, etc. You have to make sure that these things do not happen, otherwise you won't be able to sell your goods. You will lose your brand image. Also with deregulation comes removal of union power and with it the freeing up of the labour market so that people can move around more easily to find work, and also the employer has equal rights to be able to end contracts with labourers who refuse to work, except if their contracts are changed in some way. With deregulation comes the removal of trade barriers and tariffs, rather than having to wait for the general agreement on tariffs and rather than having to wait for the GATT treaty rounds to finally agree to remove some or reduce the levels of tariffs levied on people, we simply just abolish tariffs. We have cheap consumer goods coming in, cheap producer goods coming in, raw materials, etc. If we're saying that, if arguments are put that those undermine British industries, but so what? That simply means that British industry and the resources in British industry are pushed into those which are now more profitable. To say that cheap Japanese car imports undermine British workers or the jobs in British car firms is fairly nonsensical, because to say that cheap Japanese car imports harm the British economy can be taken at two levels. One is, of course, there'll be changes made. British car workers will have to become more efficient, or else move on to other forms of employment, and other forms of investment will have to occur. But for the consumer, who is supposedly to be protected against these nasty cheap car imports, what's the problem? He's simply getting a sort of better deal. He can get more for his pound. His wages are going to be thus much more useful to him. He can buy more. If the Japanese cars are supposedly being dumped below cost, it's costing the Japanese car firms to actually more to provide these cars than they can actually make in selling them. More inputs are used to create these outputs. Then it's simply that these Japanese car firms are giving things away. They're free gifts. And how many people actually object to Christmas, which is what it would be year round, until the Japanese car firm decided, well, they couldn't really stomach the losses any longer. So we have deregulation of tariffs on trade. Thus we have a more rational economy pursued. Better decisions are being made. Resources are being used more effectively and more productively than they were when the economy was just more or less a home market, or at the moment tied into the EEC. If we pursue complete free trade, then resources are going to flow into this country because people are escaping from taxation elsewhere. The other main area of how should I say, this move towards the laissez-faire economy comes in the form of protection of property rights. At the heart of the marketplace is the property right. The person's property is his own person, and hence all other property rights that flow from his sort of overall holding in his own person. What this means for political economy is that the protection of that property right in his person, and then hence the rest of his property, has to be protected in a way that is consistent with the idea of voluntarism in the marketplace. To require people to pay for defence services, security services, law and order and so forth, and compel them to pay for it, actually goes against the nature of political economy that laissez-faire is all about. Laissez-faire is about voluntarism. To force people to pay for their own defence is somewhat contradictory. The defence is sort of usually seen as a public good, requiring the state to provide it, is the general impression. In textbooks, that is certainly the impression given. However, when we consider how people put locks on their front door, put locks on their cars, to protect their property against aggression, put car alarms on, sometimes carry concealed weapons, perhaps illegally in this country, in other countries like the United States with permits, they're taking steps to protect themselves from violence and aggression. And there is also the corollary, is that the state has failed to provide the security, peace of mind that they require. Therefore, we have to ask, can the state actually provide defence, or effective defence? That people do want to protect their property, do want to ensure contracts are not broken, that fraud does not occur. Yes, that is of course true, but why do they need to have one single monopolist agent to do so? Competition tends to be best in every other field of human endeavour. Why not in production of security? With continually we find the evidence how the state is used to or uses the so-called forces of law and order to perpetuate its situation and its powers, particularly in the ex-Soviet Union with the KGB and so forth. The idea that we can have competitive security agencies does not seem to be a second sight too silly or even insensible. The fact that Britain indeed had private security services providing a range of services. The fact that Britain had private security organisations throughout the early part of the 19th century, providing a range of services and goods for customers of varying abilities to pay, varying needs, shows how a market-based orientation can be more effective than a state-based. Before the nationalisation of the police force, or exactly the municipalisation of the police force, whereby local constabularies were set up, but each under the overall control of the Home Office, we find different products being offered to customers, whereby you had thief catchers, you had lost and found organisations, various mutual protection associations, some as large and in scope as local constabularies. Indeed, these are more often. Indeed, such protection agencies are more directly associated with the victim to try to secure property back for the victim, to bring the aggressor to a state where the aggressor pays restitution for his offence, his trespass. Again, we're going back to tort law. Then the state where the state forces victims to pay taxes in order to catch the criminal, to pay taxes to put the criminal through the legal system, to pay taxes to keep the criminal who is found guilty in jail, and the victim still has not yet been compensated for the violence suffered, for the tort suffered. We see that the private security system offers a much better proposal for the victims, and indeed for the criminals who, in having to work off their debt, are seen actually to have paid off their debt and hence can come back to civil society, and also have actually learnt skills and possibly can gain employment within the economy when they come back into the economy as a whole, rather than simply being put outside as they do in the moment in the jail system. So when it comes down to it, competition, law and order, and hence defence, is another vital tenet to securing a free market and a free society. And only on this basis can we really proceed, because when the state has no longer any powers of arbitrary arrest, of arbitrary imprisonment, and the police and state power and the police and army powers to force people to pay taxes, which ultimately is the power behind taxation, we will actually maintain a society based on voluntarism.
Excellent. Okay, what critique would you give of European Union under the Treaty of Maastricht?
Right, the Treaty of Maastricht, which effectively has to be abandoned with the result of the Danish no vote.
I don't know, actually, should we just say what critique would you give of European Union? Let's figure out that.
Yeah, because otherwise it would be historically inaccurate.
Okay.
European Union can be seen in two ways. One is a move towards a integrated free economy with the removal of trade barriers, removal of European Union can be seen in two ways. One is the removal of barriers of trade, movement of capital and labour throughout Europe, and also looking outside with the removal of barriers against the rest of the world. Secondly, the European Union can be looked at as a sort of political or federalising system, whereby the individual governments are merged to become member states of an overall federal organisation. The trend of most intellectuals and academics is to say we should have the latter, that there may be some removal of trade barriers, but really the overall goal of European Union is political integration, this creation of a political superstate whereby the bureaucrats can dictate and plan the economy throughout Europe, make sure that resources are not squandered by that horrible vicious marketplace in one area in competition with firms doing exactly the same or seem to be the same research and production activities in other areas of the community, so that we can plan the economy and we can act as a whole across Europe in a sort of more organised and centrally planned manner. The fact that this is the myth of central planning that's been resurrected after its demise in the Soviet Union and elsewhere in the world does not seem to worry the proponents of European federalism. The fact that central planning doesn't work seems to worry them even less, because of the fact that their bureaucrats are trying to exert more and more power, gain more and more power and prestige in their own spheres. The alternative to this European federal superstate has to come down to the sort of market-based alternative, to allow individuals, each with his own individual rights, to try to decide his own future and to act accordingly to that within the bounds and not harming any other person. Okay, the alternative to federalism is the market process, based upon the sort of political structure of individual rights, which are based upon the alternative to a federal structure in Europe is one of a confederation of individuals through the marketplace, each individual being a sovereign power in his own right, able to make choices within the sphere of his own property, and to consent with others and engage in voluntary transactions with those other individuals. In this manner, we do not have a situation where some are compelled to accept the rulings of other people. So much so that the marketplace is ultimately the final arbiter of disputes. Individuals have to persuade other people of the potency of their arguments, and as such cannot use the power of the state to coerce people to accept regulations, taxes and so on, to accept restrictions upon their freedoms unless they consent to those restrictions. Now, we can look at this anti-federalist position, tracing back a long way. Certainly in at the start of the American sort of governmental system, we find a growing band of anti-federalists, people like Patrick Henry and George Mason and others, who are arguing against the growth of the federal government. Now, the marketplace, the anarchy of the marketplace, the anarchy of the marketplace has been given or cited as one of the reasons why the government should step in and plan and coordinate economic activity across Europe. The fact that this produces a planned chaos, as Ludwig von Mises called it, whereby the malinvestments that are created through government endeavours dislocate further the the economy and and distort market prices. I'll give that bit up. Sorry.
Okay.
Perhaps that might be it.
That'll be fine. Yeah. Okay. Should we ask the next question then?
Yeah.
What motivates you in your studies and also in the arguments you are advocating?
When it comes down to it, I started pursuing these ideas from the position of a sort of economist trying to find out, basically, widen my sphere of arguments or mode of analysis. But in the course of these investigations, I came across the ideas of libertarianism through works of David Friedman, Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. Sorry. Again, sorry. What motivates me in advocating libertarian and Austrian ideas is two things. As an economist, I'm trying to explain the reality I see around myself more effectively, to understand the market process, make sense of the spontaneous orders that we see in it, by referring those back to the purposeful activity of individuals, and seeing their outcomes, the interactions of those, as purely as the unintended consequences of purposeful human action. The state, my analysis of the state, can be seen as looking at how such purposeful human action through the marketplace has been distorted by purposeful human action through the power of the state. That the state creates distortions within the price system through inflation, regulation and taxation that lead to economic hardship and material hardship for individuals. this has been backed up and in fact accelerated in places by acceptance of and adherence to libertarian ideas, whereby individuals should not be coerced by others, that they should be free to pursue life, liberty and happiness in their own way. They should be able to go to hell in their own fashion, and should be able to also to be able to help those people they want to, interact with those people they want to, so long as there's consent of both parties. Now each seems to support the other in terms of the policy conclusions, yet an economist should really strive to be value free. However, because an economist is undertaking purposeful human action, when he undertakes the task of investigating purposeful human action, it is impossible to be totally value free. In fact, you have to be aware of your humanity, of the fact that you are a member of the human species, that you are interacting with other people in a voluntary manner when you're persuading them to the strength of your arguments. So in fact, you can't set yourself outside it. In fact, you have these goals of trying to do these things because you enjoy it, or because I enjoy it. So to be a sort of value-free economist is in fact really a misnomer. You should allow your sort of judgments to be as value-free as possible, but you have to be aware that when you read an economist's work, he is doing it because he enjoys it at the end of the day. Same way as a libertarian is motivated because he thinks a better state of affairs can be achieved by enacting his ideas. So for me, it's because I enjoy making sense of the world, and because I think a better state of affairs can be achieved by a libertarian revolution. Okay.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. Would you please tell us the fable of the bees?
The Fable of the Bees is a sort of work by Bernard Mandeville, dating back to the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century. A contemporary of Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, and also Josiah Tucker. Bernard Mandeville wrote what some people regard as a rather shocking account of the sort of market process. He described how the things that you see around you are often, or more often than not, the result of private vices and of public virtues. In fact, public virtues are the result of private vices. By pursuing his own selfish end, the artisan can achieve and sort of fulfill other people's expectations far more effectively than if he tried to pursue this fictitious public good. The baker, to quote Adam Smith, who tries to make sure that there is food for his family, there are other things for his family, has to be aware of what other people want. He has to provide bread in good quality, in various different loaves and shapes, that those people are willing to buy and purchase his services for. He then be able to take that money elsewhere and buy the things that his family requires. So by promoting his own, or by trying to achieve his own self-interest, the promotion of the well-being of his own family, the baker has to attend to the well-being of other people. He has to be aware of what other people want and to tailor his activities to that extent. Whereas the public servant who is using the state to try to achieve this is supposedly outside this selfish motive. Is beyond this selfish motivating force of the marketplace. He uses people's wages and he takes people's wages and directs them to what he considers the best end to promote the public good. In fact, he doesn't, because people do not choose to do that voluntarily. They're being forced to pay for that. So the person who attempts to seek the public good through the state, in fact, often undermines or destroys the public good, which can only be found through the marketplace, whereby individuals, through the harmonising and through the harmonising and sorry, leave that. Okay,
Well, that explains about the bees, is it?
that's effectively what.
It's a bit late in the day for the bees.
Oh, well.
We'll read out a clip of this poem. Mandeville was the author, was he?
Yeah, Bernard Mandeville.
Right. Do one more shot. They don't stay very long on these flat.